Welcome back to the History of Western Civilization. This is Professor Allen, and here is lecture number 3. So, we're picking up from where we left off last time with speaking about ancient Egypt. So let's start talking a little bit more about their Egyptian society and culture. So, first off is Egyptian society. Now, of course, the majority of the people of the nation of Egypt, or the Kingdom of Egypt, regardless of which kingdom it was, whether it was the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, or even the New Kingdom, the majority of people were going to be peasants. And of course, they were the poorest of the poor. They were the major number of the population again. They were probably about 95% or so of the population, if not more like 98 or 99%, with the other 5 to 2% being nobles and then the pharaoh himself. Well, of course, these peasants owned no land whatsoever, didn't own anything land-wise. They did, however, have usually very small homes on plots of land that was just kind of owned by the city or the kingdom itself, rather. And these hovels or huts were made usually of clay or mud, kind of, or some kind of brick or stone. Very rarely were they made of wood, because wood was a bit of a commodity in ancient Egypt, being that it was mostly desert other than the Nile River with reeds and growing things along there. But again, wood wasn't a huge resource, so they usually used mud and clay and stone for their homes. On to women, regardless of whether they were nobles or peasants, women had a little bit more rights in ancient Egyptian society than they had if they were in ancient Mesopotamia or other Eastern cultures, or even cultures that end up starting to spring up in Europe later on in the Bronze Age and things like that, and after the Bronze Age. But for the most part, women actually had more rights to an extent than mostly Eastern cultures, and some Western ones. They were equal with men of the same class. So if a woman was a peasant, then they were just as equal of a man that was a peasant. Now, they, of course, were lower than, say, a person of the noble class or of the pharaoh's class, right, of the royalty. But if they were a woman of the noble class, would have been equal to a woman of a man of the noble class. And a woman in the pharaoh's ruling elite-ish, the royal family, they would have been equal to a man there. Well, almost. But pretty much same class structure, same level as a man. And they were actually able to own land, which was very different from what ended up happening in Mesopotamia, as well as other Eastern cultures. And then even some later Western cultures, women didn't have rights to own land for a very long time. But that's for another course. They could even inherit land, items, and wealth from their father or husband if they were to die. And they were also able to engage in business and work, unlike, again, Mesopotamia and many other cultures later on, and even at this same time, where women were just thought, no, you can't do anything with business. That's a man's job, kind of idea. Which simply just isn't true when it comes to capabilities, right? Men, however, could legally have concubines, okay? They could have legal, basically, affairs with women, even though they were married. And there was nothing really that women in ancient Egyptian society could do about that legal concubine that the man that they were married to had. So that was one thing that women were not able to do anything about, and were kind of lower than men. But for the most part, they were kind of equal to men in ancient Egypt, which is quite interesting. The pharaoh, of course, we've mentioned him before, and they are typically all men, which is why I said him. Again, we've had Hatshepsut, which was a woman, but she was depicted as a man at times in art and in statues, right, because she had a beard. And other women at the time that were pharaohs, very few. There were very few other instances, but Hatshepsut is the most known one. But the other few instances, yes, they were also considered divine. But again, the pharaoh was most always a man. Now, he, of course, would have a royal family, and they were kind of considered divine as well, but then he would always be the highest one, right? The power that they held was huge, but over time, of course, as you've seen with the intermediate periods where the nobles would rise up, or the people would rise up and try to take some power back, the pharaohs started losing power over time. And sometimes even when things were restored into the kingdom, to the pharaoh, power kind of eroded from the pharaoh slowly, where the army wanted to take more, decisions on their own rather than listening to always what the pharaoh said, where the generals and leaders of the army would start going, no, we think this is best course of action, and would run most things. Same with powerful priests, especially when it came to religion. And religion was very, very important in Egyptian society, and we're going to talk a little about some instances there. And then bureaucrats, the standard government officials. You've all heard the term bureaucracy, the government in general. Well, a lot of the members of the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats started taking a little bit more power here and there from the pharaoh when pharaohs became lazy and just didn't want to do every single little thing themselves, or even be appraised of every single little situation to make a decision on it. Of course, it would be carried out by the bureaucracy normally, but over time, some pharaohs were just like, no, don't bother me unless it's something major. And so the bureaucrats ended up taking a little bit more power here and there themselves, and then the next pharaoh comes along, and they're like, oh, well, this was how it always was done. We're not going to give you it back. And some of the pharaohs just didn't care. So over time, the pharaohs started losing the power, but they were still considered to be godlike and a son or child of the gods. Polytheism is the religion of the Egyptian society. Now, of course, that's not the name for it. That's the name or term given to a religion that worships multiple gods, okay, as opposed to worshiping one god or no gods. Monotheism is for one god, but polytheism is when you worship multiple gods. And so they had multiple gods, and a couple just mentioning, there's tons, is Ammon, or Amun, with a U-N as in an O-N. It depends on the spelling. Either one is fine if you ever have an assignment or a question on that and have to mention the name, Ammon. He was the god of life, okay? And he was identified at times as being the same god or deity as Ra. Okay, Ra is the sun god, and Ra is actually pictured right there, where he's the bird-headed man right there, as well as a big disc right here, which is representing what? The sun. Right? The sun in our sky. And so they didn't know exactly what it was, but they knew it was the giver of life and everything like that, and they understood that that was life, and that was why Ra and Ammon were commonly associated with each other. Then the counterpart was Osiris, the god of death. And a lot of people think like, oh, that would be like an evil god. No, not always. Sometimes they did not thinking it is evil. Sometimes it was like, you don't want to make Osiris angry, right? But it's not someone to be feared or anything like that unless you've messed up, okay? And so that's the kind of idea, is Osiris wasn't always the god, wasn't a bad god, even though it was associated with the god of death, okay? Moving on, let's talk a little bit about their writing. So Egyptian writing was commonly and first known as hieroglyphics, okay? And here are some examples of that, carved in stone here, carved in gold here, and then just drawn or painted on stone here. And as you can see, sometimes they're kind of big pictures, and sometimes, as in this one and this one, but in this one they're pictures, but they're kind of also beginning to start to becoming a little bit more writing in there as well. Different symbols as opposed to big artistic symbols. Almost like letters. So let's talk a little bit about Egyptian writing. So, Egyptian writing was mostly done on papyrus. Yes, there are tons and tons of visuals of it on walls and things like that, and gold and items and things, but for the most part, most of it was on papyrus, right here. This is papyrus. Looks very, very similar to what? Paper, right? Paper. But how did you make this paper, this papyrus? Well, it was made from the reeds of the Nile River, okay? The reeds, like grass reeds, sticking out of the water. Something common here, right? In Louisiana with ditches and stuff like that, all those big blades of grass and stuff, overgrown weeds. And so, very similar to that. And they would have dried them out and basically stuck them to each other somehow and made it into basically paper style thing. Now, this was really good because if you think about it with Mesopotamia, remember how much of the stuff we have from Mesopotamia, all the tiny little receipts. Remember, those were carved in clay, right? And so they would have required to be baked in an oven or baked out in the sun just to dry before the clay was hard and you could give the receipt to someone. So someone would have to come back, right, the next day or something to get their receipt. Or even, carve something out and they can't just use it right then and there. They would have to wait until it was hardened before they could really use it and store it anywhere. So this papyrus was much more efficient than the ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets and other places that used clay tablets. Okay, so that's one impressive thing here, because you can just write on it, and they would use like ink or dye or something or paint to write on these papyrus sheets. It was lightweight and cheap. They could store it in like tube, or not tubes, but they could roll it up, kind of like a tube, and stick places. You could stack it like paper is stacked today. Things like that. And it's cheap. It's really cheap to make. A lot easier to make necessarily than clay tablets, which sometimes, well, if you run out of clay, yeah, you could run out of the papyrus, but there's always more of it somewhere. You didn't have to go digging in the mud to get more clay, like that would be for the tablets. So it was lightweight and cheap. Later on, when we talk about the Greeks and the Romans, they used papyrus. And we have some records in papyrus from them, but not as much. And the reason why is because both Greece and Rome, or Italy rather, were more moist climates, okay? While Egypt is a very dry climate, very little rainfall. The reason why they've got so much life and everything there is because of the water, right, from the Nile River. And that's not in the atmosphere. So this papyrus in Egypt lasts forever, or can almost last forever without really degrading issues. If you leave a piece of paper out today in the weather outside your house or apartment or wherever you live, it will degrade pretty quick, right? From the moisture, especially if it's a rainy day, if it gets wet or whatever, it's going to start degrading, stuff like that. Just the humidity itself here in Louisiana and other places is going to affect it. It's going to start degrading pretty quick, within a few days, if not weeks or months, let alone years. Well, this papyrus has lasted now thousands of years in Egypt perfectly fine, because there is hardly any moisture in the climate there. And so it's allowed administrative records, so receipts, things about the government, etc., as well as short stories, which means what? Real short stories, real actual stories about their fiction and about lives and stuff like that there, as well as tons and tons of lists of kings. And there are tons of kings in ancient Egypt. It would take me almost an entire video just to list them by name for 20 or 30 minutes, just non-stop just saying their names. If I were to do that. And that's just ridiculous. That's why we haven't studied all of them. I've only talked about a couple. And we're going to talk about another one or two today in this video. Hieroglyphics in general, okay, back to hieroglyphics rather than the paper that it's written on, were mostly just in the Archaic and Old Kingdom periods. So the Archaic period before the Old Kingdom, and then the Old Kingdom itself, and then kind of by the time that it had gotten into the Intermediate period or the Middle Kingdom, they started not using hieroglyphics anymore. They started going to more of a different type of Egyptian writing, which was no longer just hieroglyphic pictures representing words, okay? And it was now moving into the second component of their language, which was kind of each symbol now means a syllable, okay? So part of a word, okay? A syllable. And eventually, over time, by the time it definitely got to the New Kingdom period, give or take, a few hundred years, we've got it to the point where each little symbol now means parts of an alphabet. Now, they're alphabetic elements as opposed to letters, okay? Because these alphabetic elements are representing consonants, but they've never separated the consonant from the vowel. So you're never ever going to see an Egyptian vowel by itself if you're reading ancient Egyptian reading, okay, and writings. You're only ever going to see the consonant and the vowel together. So it's not exactly an alphabet like we have today, okay? It's its own thing on its own. So it's not exactly an alphabet. The first people who ever created an alphabetic script, which we'll cover in another lecture, not this video, but on lecture 4, are the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. Okay? The Phoenicians and the Canaanites should be covered in lecture number 4. Okay? Moving on. The Rosetta Stone. So, the Rosetta Stone is extremely important. Now, it was written in the year 196 B.C.E. I know that's a way away from what we've got into so far in ancient Egypt, okay? It's 196 BCE is 2,200 and so years ago. Okay, 2,200 and about 20 years ago. Or 2,214 years ago, give or take. So, yes, a long time ago, but as opposed to the rest of the ancient Egyptian stuff that we've been talking about is more like 4,000, 5,000 years ago, right? Now, why is this important? It's so important because of when it was recovered and what is on it. Okay, so a little bit of history about it. It is known as the Pierre de Rosette, which is the French name. Okay, the Rosetta Stone, the Pierre de Rosette, is this big giant thing right here in these two images. I took this image. This one was from a website. And it was discovered by the French. In fact, a soldier in Napoleon's army in the year 1799 CE, so current era, so only about 200 years ago, discovered it while on a military expedition in Egypt. Napoleon, big French guy, or relatively short French guy, conquering part of Europe, which is all in Western civilization too, if you should ever take it with me, ran around in Egypt as well. And when his soldiers were looking for water in Egypt, they ended up stumbling upon this rock, which had a bunch of writing on it. And it was from 1,800 years before, actually 2,000 years before when it was made. And this soldier, Pierre-Francois Bouchard, is the man who found it, the soldier who found it. Well, that soldier couldn't read any of it, and took it to a scholar on the trip, one of the scientists that Napoleon had brought with him, named Jean-Francois Champollion. Okay? And that scholar and linguist, okay, he was a historian and he was very good with reading different languages, studied and translated the writing on the stone and figured out what it was. Because if you look at the stone, it has, and I'll go quickly to this slide, you can kind of see this is what the stone should have looked like, okay? And there's a big section here, there's another section here, and another section here, as you can see on this one, and even here, here, and here in the real life pictures to it there. And the top one is in a different language than this one, and those both are in a different language than this one. It's 3 individual languages, and the 3 languages are hieroglyphics. So right here, it would have been the hieroglyphic pictures, okay? Before this time, in the year 1799, so about 200 years ago from today, no one could read hieroglyphics. No one they were like, okay, what's the bird mean? Okay? What's that guy with the weird stick mean? Okay? What's the sun mean? Well, that maybe means the sun, but maybe it means something else too. People didn't know. And so we were having a really hard time figuring it out. The second section, the middle section, is actually written in something called Demotic Egyptian, which was the Egyptian which was having to do with this alphabetic elements, okay? This alphabet version with the consonants, okay? Demotic Egyptian. It was the ancient Egyptian writing at that time. And then the third language at the bottom was Greek, okay? Was Greek. And that was because by the year 196 BCE, when we cover that period when we talk about the Greeks and Alexander the Great, some of you may have heard of him. If not, that's fine. We're going to cover him in a whole day. The Greeks had taken over Egypt at that time. And so they were speaking Greek language there, as well as Demotic Egyptian still, and some people still even loved in Egypt to read ancient hieroglyphs. So that is why this rock, this Rosetta Stone, has the same writing 3 times on it, all because, and what it talks about is this king, Ptolemy V, V means 5, okay, V means 5 when talking about royalty. It's the ancient Roman language for numbering. Ptolemy, he was a king of both part of Greece and also part of Egypt at the time. Again, we'll talk about him later on. Pops up on the scene and becomes the new king. And so it was basically all about his coronation, with him getting his crown and the ceremony and stuff like that. And so that is what the Rosetta Stone is. And of course, it's really big because it says the same thing. And what's really cool is Champollion, he could read the Greek. He could read the Greek language, and he could kind of read the Demotic Egyptian. He was kind of understanding that, but he didn't know every single letter and word in it. But he didn't know what the hieroglyphs mean. And then when he figured out that the Greek and the Demotic Egyptian were the same, he realized the hieroglyphs mean the same thing too. And so that is why the Rosetta Stone is so important, because it was the key that unlocked everything for us to understand ancient Egyptian writing. And because of that, now we have so much more information able to read it out of ancient Egypt than we did over 200 years ago. That we just, oh cool, pretty pictures, and that was about it. So this image is actually a picture taken by me in this London Museum. You can actually see my reflection right there. This is a picture of the head of the Museum of London standing next to it. Both of these pictures are there to see how big the Rosetta Stone is, okay, because it's big. Like, this thing is a really big stone, an important discovery. And really, it's basically all shown right here. Okay, hieroglyphics, Demotic Egyptian, and Greek are the 3 languages about it. And it's important to the modern age, finally, us being able to read hieroglyphics. Okay, moving on to Akhenaten. So Akhenaten is a very interesting pharaoh, and one that we are going to spend a few minutes talking about to end this video before moving on to the next video for the second part of this lecture. So Akhenaten is the name that we'll use at times, but he was originally born in 1352 and was named Amenhotep IV. Okay, IV is, again, one of those Roman numerals, Roman writing for 4, number 4. So there were 3 other kings before him called Amenhotep. But don't worry about that. More importantly, just his name was Amenhotep. And it meant Ammon is pleased. Remember that Ammon was the god of life, okay? So his name meant Ammon, the god of life is pleased. Well, Amenhotep, when he became pharaoh, started deciding that he wanted to make the sun god, Ra, the main god. He liked Ra more than Ammon. He liked Ra more than any of the other gods. And remember, there were many gods at that time that all of the Egyptians worshipped all at the same time. If you wanted to worship the sun that day because you had it was a sunny, nice day, you would worship the sun that day. If you needed like the water to not flood your house or whatever because of the river Nile coming near your house, then you would pray hoping to the river god that the Nile wouldn't flood your house. Stuff like that. Anything you needed, you would pray to that specific god. Well, he always liked Ra more than any of the others. And over time, he literally changed, according to policy, according to Egyptian governmental policy, is that Ra is now the leader god of all the others. Soon after that, Amenhotep IV then changed Ra's name to Aten. A-T-E-N. Aten. Okay? And started having all of the artists and writers in Egypt at that time start making Aten, this new god, this god that's now been changed from Ra, not to just represent the sun, but now to also represent not just the sun, but the sun's rays. The rays of sun. Kind of like, if you look at this picture, it kind of looks like when little kids draw like the sun in their art at home in kindergarten and stuff like that, with the big rays, the big lines sticking out, the rays of sun. It's very similar to that. It's kind of funny that 3,350 something years ago, or 3,370 something years ago, people were still doing these lines as they are now, right? When drawing stuff for the sun. But he changed it to that. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal. That, yeah, it's the sun and the sun's rays. Yeah, what big deal? But he's changing their religion. And if you think about someone trying to change your religion and your government trying to change it and force you to do that change, you're not going to like it, right? And you're not going to like this next bit even more. He changes his own name to Akhenaten from Amenhotep. So Akhenaten is why it's up here. And so he does this, and Akhenaten means he who is profitable to the Aten, meaning he who makes profit and gets life from the sun, okay, from the Aten, okay. He then starts demanding that everybody worship only Aten. Only Aten. So he forbids the worship of other gods. Now, there is one exception to that worship only Aten. You can also worship me because I am Akhenaten, so I'm kind of the same as Aten, pictured here and here, but this is now Aten, as opposed to just the sun, which was Ra. And so you are able to worship me, the pharaoh, and Aten at the same time, because I'm kind of also Aten at this point, is what he's telling his followers. So what used to be a polytheistic religion, remember, polytheistic, which we talked about up in a previous slide, not that one, but this one, polytheism, remember the worship of many gods, okay? They are no longer allowed to be that. He is now forcing them to be quasi-monotheistic. Monotheistic is the worship of one god, and why I have it say quasi is because it's kind of monotheistic. Because again, he's forcing them to worship one god, okay? But also himself, so it's kind of two. Now this really upsets the people. They are not allowed to worship any of the other gods. Osiris, the god of death, the god of the river, the god of any of the plants, the god of the homes, any of it. None of them are allowed to be worshipped anymore. And so it really upsets the people. So what happens is, well, he's likely murdered in the year 1336 BCE for forcing monotheism on the people. The records are kind of sketchy on what actually happens to him. He just dies at a very young age, and it is likely by murder. And it was definitely apparent in the records that we've seen, that we have translated, and what we do have, is that, yeah, people really hated this guy when he started changing everything. His name was not spoken after his death. Now, that might sound weird. Well, this is why. His name wasn't spoken after his death because the ancient Egyptians believed that speaking someone's name after they died would get them into heaven, okay, or get them into their afterlife, their version of heaven, okay, the good afterlife. But if you didn't speak the person's name ever again, that person would not get into the good afterlife and would probably stay in the bad one. And so it's very interesting that they just stopped saying his name. However, every single time I feel like I give this lecture, I feel like I'm almost saying his name enough times to help him get there, if that happens. That's kind of just a joke, but, who knows? Akhenaten, however, did have a son at his young age, okay? And now the son was very young when Akhenaten was killed. or died, regardless of whether he was killed, but he was probably murdered. And his son's name was Tutankhaten. Okay, Tutankhaten. And he, of course, becomes pharaoh or king. Well, Tutankhaten grows up and starts realizing everyone hated Dad because he changed the religion and he changed everything, and I don't like this Aten part of my name. I am going to change it back to Ammon. Okay, and so he renames himself Tutankhamun and allows people to stop worshipping this quasi-monotheistic way, and he also changes Aten back to Ra, and he changes a ton of things, and he says, yes, worship all the other gods again. And so Tutankhamun, or with a UN, okay, same name, just different spelling. He is commonly known today as King Tut, okay? And so King Tut you may have heard of, and I've got some pictures of his burial area, and we will talk about that in the next video.